My name is Rhonda Kingman. I am 67, soon to be 68 at the end of this month. It is October 11th, 2014. We are here at the San Francisco Public Library at Civic Center, and I'm here with Helena, whom I just met.
And my name is Helena Worthen. I'm going to be 71 in about 2 weeks. Today is October 11th, 2014, and I'm here with Rhonda at the San Francisco Public Library. And I just met Rhonda. And I didn't try to arrange for one of my family to come and be with me because I have mixed feelings about what I want to do today. And I'm going to try to explain that by telling a little story about somebody that I had in a class when I was teaching at Contra Costa Community College back in the 1980s. I was an English teacher. I've done a lot of writing, so I was teaching English. And there was an old guy, 82 years old, who was taking everybody's classes. He was a cheerful, open-faced, white-haired little guy, very sturdy. And he would show up in just about any class that was open. And he in my class, he functioned kind of as an assistant teacher, sort of almost like a social worker in the class. He was so friendly and supportive and interested in other people. He didn't take up extra space. He was a real blessing to have around. He had been a house painter in Philadelphia, and one time after class, he described how he had come out to California. His wife had died. He'd been very depressed. He came to California to be with his children and grandchildren, but they really didn't have a lot to do with him. And so he started coming to these classes, and in order to kind of build a family around him. But he said that there was one thing that he couldn't tell anybody. And he was telling me because, sort of as his co-teacher, I guess. But this was something that he said was so sad that if he told any of these people that he was being friends with, it would make them cry unbearably. And this was that when he was a little boy in Philadelphia, he could leave Center City and run to the outskirts of the city, and in 15 minutes he would be out among the apple orchards. And now, at 71, I know how that feels because I don't think my kids or my grandkids are ever going to live in a city where they can run from the center of the city and in 15 minutes not be in some suburb or some Walmart parking lot or some some strip mall somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Just for the idea that you could go from a city into the country and have that uncluttered, open, sure, agricultural space, but open space where everyone could walk. The idea that is kind of gone forever in our country and probably most other places is, to me, almost too painful to talk about. But I still feel that this may be a place where I actually could talk about it. And in order to do that, I want to describe the landscape where I spent my summers as a little girl. This was in Cummington, Massachusetts, and it still exists, as I will, at the end of this interview, if I let Rhonda have a chance to say anything, so that it becomes a real interview. At the end, I want to describe a little bit about what it's like there right now. But here's what it was like when I was little. My grandfather bought this place right around the end of World War I. So we're talking 1916, 1917. And my mother would have been about 8 years old, and her little sister Margaret would have been about 6 years old. And it was an old house that had at one point been a stage house because there used to be a road that went all the way up the mountain past it. Half of that road, the part up the mountain beyond the house, was now overgrown and had turned into kind of a brook. It was a big house with a barn and an attic And in the attic, there were many rooms and nooks and crannies. We were always discovering another part of the attic that had something in it that we didn't expect. When I say we, I mean myself, my little brother Hillary, who now lives in Berkeley, which is where I live, and my cousins, Alison, who is a retired librarian and lives in Southern California, and my other cousin Jeffrey, who lives in New Hampshire. We would explore inside the house, but what I really want to tell you more about is what it was like to explore outside the house. And if we go around in kind of a 360-degree sweep around this landscape, to the west, up the mountain, there was a long pipe that went all the way up to a spring. And the water that fed the house came from that spring, and it traveled through logs that were gutted out and then hooked together with metal or leather. So the water in the house tasted strongly of whatever kind of wood the water was coming down from the spring in. If you continue around the circle, then you come to the old road that would go up kind of along what was now a washed-out brook. And you'd come to a crossroad about half a mile up. Beyond that was Farmer Gurney's farm, where he had pear trees that would get ripe and would have the best pears in the world. And he had a huge barn. He had a black and white Dalmatian that would catch us. The black and white Dalmatian was called Pepper, and he would call out, "Pepper, Pepper!" And that would prevent us from climbing up into his barn and jumping in his hayloft, which would have been a great thing to do. Then, if you come back down to the house and you're moving a little bit more to the north, you come to the dump. The dump is where we would carry out refuse, tin cans, bottles, pieces of lumber, anything that you wanted to get rid of. You would follow this path and walk way, way, way out into the forest, and there you would dump whatever you wanted to dump. It was kind of unlimited open space, so you could, nobody ever thought about there not being enough landfill.
Right.
But this dump had been there since the 1700s. So at the far end of the dump, you could start to go and unearth things and find beautiful bottles and dishes with, painted dishes that were cracked but that were painted and gorgeous. So the dump at one end was a place where you got rid of things, and at the other end it was a place where you dug up the whole history of everyone who had lived in the house.
An archaeological dig.
Exactly. And we're talking about something that was, 40 feet long.
Wow.
And the far side of it was all overgrown with ferns and vines. And then moving to the right, to the east, there was the badminton field and the incinerator where we would burn anything we wanted to burn. The incinerator was a big a metal barrel, and you just dump stuff in it and watch it burn. And that was actually fun. Taking the stuff out to the incinerator after a meal was considered a sort of privilege. But then beyond that was just something you could see kind of through the trees was a little white house, a clapboard house with a green shingle roof and green painted steps going up to it. And in that house were all my grandfather's books, because he would leave Swarthmore, where he was a professor, and pack his books into wooden boxes and ship them up by train. And in the summer, he would be in that house working on his books all summer long. He eventually published quite a lot of stuff, academic stuff, but the thing that is still going is The Meaning of Shakespeare, which I actually cash a check from the University of Chicago every year for about $500.
Wow.
For copies of this book that he wrote sitting in that little white house there. After he died, his books stayed there. He died when I was about 6. his books just stayed there. And so my cousins and I would go out there and read. And so as a 9, 10, 11 years old, I was leafing through things like the illustrated version of The Golden Ass of Apuleius, which is if I remember correctly, it's sort of an obscene medieval erotic novel. Anyway, there was nobody said don't read this or don't read that. So I read everything I wanted to, sitting in his old Morris chair. In front of that little white house was actually a wild strawberry field where there were real wild strawberries that were extremely sweet. Beyond it, there was what we called the 10-acre field, which might have been bigger. There was a farmer named Charlie Thayer, whose name is still mentioned with respect around Cummington. And he farmed all the areas around our house, and he farmed a whole lot of other people's land as well. And that field went on, seemed to me, as far as the eye could see. We would often play tag running through the tall corn, which Charlie Thayer didn't like because we would knock the corn stalks down. But there's really nothing like having 10 acres of tall green corn stalks to chase your cousins in. There was also a site of an old lumber yard. Must have been back in the 20s when there'd been a lumbering operation. So there were piles 30 or 40 feet high of sawn lumber that wasn't good lumber. It had bark on it. It wasn't what they carted away. But there was also a sawdust pile. And in the middle of the sawdust pile, imagine a sawdust pile that's about 25 feet high. And in the middle of it, some trees have grown up so that the sawdust pile is kind of clinging to these trees. And you can climb up the sawdust pile and hang from the top of the trees and swing out into the rest of the sawdust pile.
That sounds wonderful.
And of course, when our parents found out that we were doing this, they could think of all kinds of ways that it could be dangerous, like the piles of wood could fall on your head, or the sawdust pile could collapse. But by then, we had been doing it for quite a long time, and we certainly hadn't told anybody what we were doing. At the far end of that field, there was a rock formation that was very suited for sticking a ridgepole from one nearby tree into the top of the rock formation and building a whole bunch of huts. So we built huts there, and we slept in them. And my father was a history teacher who had been in World War II and been very Navy-oriented and kind of believed in telling scary ghost stories and disciplining children by scaring them, which I unfortunately still do myself. He would actually come out in the middle of the night and bang rocks together and go, "Ooh," like that when we were trying to sleep in these huts. I have to mention that near that hut is a place where my cousin Jeffrey and I had been planning to go on a adventure of some sort, and my little brother Hillary, who was just crawling, was trying to follow us.
Oh.
And we stepped aside to avoid having Hillary follow us. And he actually kept on going, apparently the entire length of the 10-acre field and up over the rock formation and down into the other side of the mountain.
Wow.
Because when lunch came and dinner came and he was nowhere to be found, my mother locked me in the bedroom, and by then the police were there, and the bloodhounds from Northampton were there, and it was the bloodhounds that found my little brother crawling along way, way, way off in the woods with his diapers arranged in a line, and he said he was playing choo-choo. So that was actually that was actually really terrible. I did not lose him on purpose. I want to say this right now, in case anyone listens to this. I didn't do it on purpose.
Especially him.
Right. I just didn't want him following us.
Mm-hmm.
And besides, it turned out that although my mom should have been aware of where we were, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we didn't want her to know where we were, but technically it was her responsibility. She was in the middle of editing my grandfather's book, because by then my grandfather had died. The book was in the process of going through editing. They were worried about the footnotes. And she had hired a babysitter, and there actually was a babysitter who was supposed to be on duty when Jeffrey and I walked off and Hillary wandered off into the woods. So then, if you keep moving around the circle, and you go to your right, you come to an area which I remember from before my grandfather died. Something he used to do with his students was have them take selections from the great authors that they read, and he taught poetry and modern Russian literature and lots and lots of Shakespeare and Yeats and everybody, Blake especially. He would have his students get quotes, their favorite quotes from poets or from novelists, and write them on little slips of paper and think of them as medicine, like an inspiring quote that would cheer you up or something like that. And he would have them put them in nutshells, and then he built a pharmacy for different afflictions that could overcome you, that was full of all these little quotes from Blake and Dostoevsky. He also hung little bags of poetry from the branches of the pine trees in the next part of the woods. So there was a walk that you could take with him that I remember going on, where you would pass pine trees with these little mesh bags with poetry hanging in them. It seems a little hard to believe, but by that time, he was finishing his book. He was mostly retired. He had cancer. Mm. He had a short horizon out in front of him, and he was dedicating a lot of his life to me personally. At least that was my experience of that time, right. Was that he had really nothing else to do except tell me stories and draw pictures and take me on walks. So that was one area where we would go on walks. The land had been all pasture to begin with. And then as farming became less and less of a big, profitable, fields that were abandoned would become first blueberry patches with birch trees and blueberry bushes, and then the pines would set in. And so this was a part of the land where the pine trees were already there, and you could walk along a soft, brown pine needle path among these fairly young pine trees. Continuing around the circle, if you go to the southeast of the house now, and if you're on the back terrace of the house looking out from under the maple trees, over the tops of my grandmother's garden, which was all delphiniums and roses and phlox, then you would see the stone wall that was the boundary of the main blueberry patch, which is where we got most of our blueberries. And down at the bottom of that blueberry patch, there was a brook that ran down the mountain, probably from the same spring where the house water came from. And it passed into an area where there were cows. And when you get cows mixed with birch trees and a brook, the cows actually nibble the grass down so that it's like being on a golf course. So it's like a golf course with a brook running through it and blueberry bushes with blueberries that are up high beyond where the cows can reach them. And my cousins and I, and my brother, would go down there, and having read a lot of, Greek and Roman mythology, due to going out and spending a lot of time in the little house reading whatever was available, we would all take our clothes off. That was, as soon as we were out of the side of the house, we would take our clothes off and be nymphs and dryads and satyrs. And that was the game. We would also dress in ground pine, long strings of ground pine, to the extent that we dressed. And we would spend the day, more or less, splashing around the brook on this sort of golf course grassiness under the blueberry bushes with an occasional cow wandering by going moo.
Yeah.
And we had names for different parts of this area. Very simple names like Billy Goat's Island was one. I remember that was Jeffrey had to spend most of his time on Billy Goat's Island while Alison and I played somewhere else. There were also little pools where you could actually swim. Mm-hmm. Very pretty little pools. The name of the brook was the Whitestone Brook. And beginning with my grandfather, the idea was that every time you actually crossed the brook, whether it was on foot or in a car, you would drop a white stone into it. So it was a really little brook. It went under the road in a culvert that was about 2.5 feet high, mm-hmm. and was just the right height for a kid to crawl through and go hoo hoo and get a little tiny bit of an echo. But we took it very seriously that you had to put white stones in it. And I remember that when we actually sold the place, and we usually say when my father sold the place, because this was in about 1960, and it was really too big for him to handle.
How old were you at that time?
In 1960, I would have been 17. I was just going off to college. Mm-hmm. And I remember we drove down the road, and my mother threw a white stone into the Whitestone Brook. So I want to tell one more thing about what was close to the house, and then, if there's time, I want to describe what it was like to be able to leave that area on foot as a child, mm-hmm. And sort of what I was allowed to do as compared to what kids are allowed to do today.
Right.
Long time ago, when the road had been built, it was a dirt road, and it still is a dirt road. Someone had planted maples all along the road, so about every 20 feet there were these great big old maples. And when my mother was a little girl, she had named the closest maple to the house Yggdrasil, which is the name of the tree out of which the whole population of Earth springs in Norse mythology, I think. Okay. I think that's right. And so there was a tree called Yggdrasil, and you would just say, where are you going? I'm going out. I'll be over near Yggdrasil, or I'll meet you at Yggdrasil. And I would build towns. The roots of Yggdrasil went way out in many directions, and I would build towns and villages in among those roots. So when I think it was by the time I was about 8 or 9, you might be wondering where are all the other kids, right? Because, being up here, it was a wonderful place with a lot to do when my cousins were there. But when my cousins weren't there, the lack of other kids to play with was mm-hmm. a big deal. Yeah. And there was one place where kids would gather, and that was the swimming hole down in the village. And we were probably 4 or 5 miles from the village. And furthermore, the swimming hole was on the far side of the village. So I'll bet it was, now I haven't measured this recently, but I would guess it was 5 or 6 miles. Mm-hmm. And I was allowed to walk there as a little kid, which I can hardly imagine a parent these days letting a kid do that, just to take a swimming towel over my shoulder and having my bathing suit on under my shorts and my T-shirt. And I would walk off down the road, and I would cut across farms, not following the road, climbing the hills up behind the village, mm-hmm. because that was a short way to go, and then down into the West River. Maybe it's the Swift River. I think it's actually the Swift River, not the West River. And find the swimming hole, and that's where you would see other kids. So this was a hugely motivating for me, would be to go down there and find other kids to play with. And then when I was done, I would walk all the way back.
Do you have any idea how long it took you to hike that route?
It would be pretty much all day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, yes. I've been back. You leave a road. There's a 2-lane asphalt road that follows the river, and you follow some dirt tracks that were actually car tracks down through some sandy floodplain territory, and then it slopes, and there's a rocky shore, and then the water is not moving terribly fast unless there's been a lot of rain. And then there are stones that for some reason are lined up along the flow of the river that stick up out of the water, and you can make your way out to the first set, and then if you're one of the big kids, you want to get into the next part of the water and make it out to the next set, which actually climb up into the hill, and there would be always some older boys who were jumping off the top rocks and doing cannonballs into the water.
Now, were these rocks placed there, do you think, to dam the? No, this is all natural.
This is the way the river looks.
Yeah.
Cummington itself, you were likely to meet not just village kids there, but people from all over the place, because Cummington itself, and I had 2 music schools in it and some very interesting history. It was one of the towns that welcomed Jewish refugees from Austria right after the Putsch. And there's a movie actually called Only One Cummington that was made about about how this cranky little Berkshire town welcomed these complete strangers from Vienna and from around Austria into their midst. Some of these people were friends of my parents, because my mother was a pianist, and she would play. There was a man named Mr. Königsberger who was a violinist. He had been a Jewish insurance agent in Vienna, and now he was in the United States. And he and my mom would get together and play Mozart sonatas. So you would meet people like that at the swimming hole who might be speaking with accents or even speaking in other languages. And then there would be people who came for the music schools. The Cummington School of the Arts was flourishing at that time. And it was it was a summer destination for bohemians from New York. That was the first place I ever saw Marimekko cloth. Somebody wearing beautiful, bright colors. Mm-hmm. And then another music camp there is called Greenwood. At the time that I was growing up there, Greenwood was relatively accessible. If you played an instrument, you could go and get lessons and be part of an orchestra and sing in the chorus. Now it's incredibly competitive. It's the kids who are already in the Juilliard programs who are going there now.
Yeah.
And they give concerts that are just amazing.
Can I ask you, interrupt for just a minute?
Please.
So all of this activity took place in the summers.
That's true.
When you were visiting.
Yes.
So where did you live when you were in your sort of mundane life, when you were going to school, and where was your home?
That's a whole different story.
Oh, okay.
But no, I can say we were, my dad taught at a boys' prep school south of Cleveland called Western Reserve Academy. And we would get in the car and make the 2-day trip pre-interstate from the Berkshires out towards Cleveland and then south to Hudson, Ohio, which is where we lived.
Okay.
And we lived in faculty housing there. And he taught, he would be on duty at night and teaching, available 24/7. And we lived a very different life there.
Mm-hmm. What made being able to, be in this place in the Berkshires in the summer, how do you think that impacted you and the way you think about life? I
think for a long time, I I was saying to myself that I will not have children until I have 100 acres for them to play on. I think of that amount of open space and freedom as something that's really necessary for kids to grow up. Of course, and I had my first child, I was living in a little tiny ground floor apartment in Berkeley, and we managed just fine with a park nearby. But it gave me I think I still have a set of minimum expectations for what everybody ought to have. And I'm glad you asked that, because, as I think about how wonderful it was for me to be able to just walk off for the day and be, wander through everybody's farms and backyards, I think about the Golden Gate National Recreation Area and how important that is, and how important the beach is. And I think the Coastal Zone Commission is something everybody should defend with their lives, with their last breaths. And I don't think that there's really ever enough good, beautiful, well-kept public space around for everybody. And when I think of children growing up where they have to get in a car in order to go to a green open space, it just makes my heart sink.
I'm with you. I was one of those kids whose parents were like, we're leaving to the mountains. Can you describe, I know you talked a little bit about the little white house, but could you describe like what it was like being in there and reading, and was it in the morning? Was it in the afternoon? What was it like?
Okay. There were really two rooms. One of the rooms had a cot in it, which implied that somebody slept in it. The other room had bookshelves made of raw pine, just hammered together. But there was a big chair which had belonged to my great uncle when he was a student at Amherst back in the aughts. It was a real Morris chair, with a bar in the back that flips back, very, simple design. And I could curl up in that chair and be very, very comfortable for many hours. Now, since you asked, it was an extremely private place, so that when my cousin Alison and I got out there, we would engage in stuff that we felt nobody would ever find out about. For example, she had a huge collection of stuffed animals, and we wrote little books about those stuffed animals. We used those black and white spotted spiral notebooks, and we wrote them in these stories, and we illustrated them. And we gave those animals hypothetical sex lives.
I love this.
Because what did we know? I guess I'd been reading The Golden Ass of Apuleius and whatever else, and all this Greek mythology with, people romping around the urns. And so we continued the tradition. And, I think it was just sort of a hypothetical what if. What if this happened? What if that happened? What if they did that or they did something else? And sometimes there would be human beings in the story, sometimes would. My point here is that it was a very private place. And we were, just as we could leave and walk through, everybody's backyard, we were also imaginatively, at least not leashed in about what we thought about and what we tried to figure out. Now, I have to say that Alison did tell on me. And my mother got very upset and actually burned.
Oh, no.
Burned our book in the fireplace in the living room. And I remember watching the pages burn.
Oh.
Any other questions?
wonderful stories. Just wonderful. Every kid should have a place like that, really.
Yes, I think so.
Every kid. To really, truly have that freedom to just explore a lot of things that they've been wondering about and thinking about, and now they've got this private place maybe where they can do it. And there's nothing wrong with any of that. I think it's
they were
wonderful.
Stuffed animals.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
But remember that I started this by talking about the house painter from Philadelphia who didn't want to tell the story about how the ability to start at Center City and run in 15 minutes and be among the apple trees. He didn't want to tell people that story because he thought it would be too upsetting for them to hear it. And those are also my hesitations about telling this story as well. I mean, I think once I came out to California, I went to landscape architecture school, and partly, to the extent that I practiced landscape architecture, I did try to build gardens that would make that kind of experience possible. But I don't, it makes me sad beyond something that I feel safe communicating to think about the world in which my grandchildren are going to grow up. I've just finished reading The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Colbert? Yeah, I think it's Elizabeth Colbert, yeah.
From the New Yorker?
Right,
yeah.
Yes. Have you?
I haven't read it, no, not yet.
That makes me think that when my grandkids are in their 40s, they're going to, if they do well, if they have money, they will live in a world in which land is either destroyed or managed, and animals are either domestic or extinct. And the animals that they know and can see and be around will all be there because because they're being raised for food, or they're being raised for entertainment or for work or something. But the wild animals, the animals even like the porcupine that would eat the wood in the woodshed, will be gone.
Yeah.
Could you describe a little bit about yourself when you were young? What kind of a young person were you like? What did you like to wear? Just a little bit about who you were.
I was skinny, and I could climb trees very fast. I took my shoes off in early June and didn't put them on until September. There's a whole Victorian tradition of sort of wild girls. W.H. Hudson has a book about a kind of a wild girl in the Amazon, and I kind of pictured myself as being a forest creature, a wild girl like that. I sewed a lot. I sewed doll clothes, and I began sewing my own clothes as soon as I could. And of course, I wanted to buy a lot of clothes, but we didn't have a lot of money, so I wasn't going to be going out buying clothes in department stores. But I did cut pictures out of the New York Times, and I kept a fashion scrapbook. So it was a funny combination of being this, girl who dressed in ground pine down near the Whitestone Brook, and also was cutting out pictures of Chanel and Givenchy dresses from the New York Times on Sundays. I also became very interested in music and threw myself, starting at about age 10, I threw myself into practicing the cello. So I would be playing the cello. By the time I was finishing high school, I was playing 4 or 5 hours a day, and that kind of calmed me down.
How did you feel at 17 when you found out that this was no longer a place where you were going to be able to go?
Oh, I made a pact with my brother that we would buy it back, which we have not done.
Mm-hmm.
He says that he actually spends his summers on an island in Maine, which is probably a nicer place. And my husband and I spend our summers at a little village in southern Vermont, which is right up against the Green Mountains, and it's where three rivers come together, and it's just fine. Mm-hmm. And I also solved my spatial problems by getting into a red truck with my boyfriend and coming to California. And dancing on the beach along with a lot of other people at that time.
Helena, I am so glad you came in today. This has been absolutely delightful. And you've reminded me, listening to your story, of a lot of things that I did as a kid, which I can tell you about when we step out of the booth, but because we're almost out of time. But I am so glad you came in. It's been wonderful.
Thank you very much. You've been the perfect interviewer.